Are there any questions from the floor to kick us off? None from the floor straight away. So we'll there's a couple that have come in on the internet. So one of them was, we've asked the question, what value can standardization bring to the OTT app developer? But I would like to know what value standardization brings to companies like Twilio or IMSWorks. Does it help or hurt their business? So start off with you two.
So the question, does standardization
Could you
help?
bring the microphone? Thanks.
So the question is, does standardization help or hurt? I think in general, standardization helps. I mean, that's kind of the way we see it. An example is WebRTC. I mean, we have an API that allows people to build, at least the IP component of voice communication, and the more that we can tie into what is a recognized standard, again, the better the developer experience is. Our aim is to try to make it as simple as possible, and therefore as little deviation from what is the standard or accepted norm as possible.
Shannon.
From our perspective, I'm not sure standardization itself brings much value at all. I agree with the ease of use and as minimal as possible so that there's a norm. I like that term, a norm, or what people are expecting to use. But as far as outright standardization, is it going to add any value? I don't think so. I think it's been said now a couple of times that a good developer is going to be able to make use and integrate to an API as long as it's a good API.
Great.
From our perspective, standardization helped us maybe not, in one way, it'd be nice to have one interface that we could, like the federation that Michel mentioned, that we could go and query location or send SMS to multiple operators. So from that standpoint, it's more than standardization. It's a single interface that gives you some reach, much like what Twilio does. But I think the advance of standardization, the help that it provided us is this, we could do the second, third, fourth implementation very quickly.
It also, the standardization is also depend on what you want to standardize. So when you look at the concern you had described on management, some of these things are so generic that you could standardize them, and actually the TMF is working on that. Other things, which are much more high level and semantic, standardization will be so difficult anyway that at that point it may happen, but it's not like a mandatory thing.
So it'll be interesting to hear. John Wilms is here from TM Forum, so he'll be speaking after lunch. So we can hold some of those questions, which I think link into some of your points a bit later. Sorry.
Just very briefly. I think we found the value of standardization comes when you have a real potential for federation across operators, for example. If we can serve our customers using a proprietary API and get started in business, we'll do so. I mean, time to market and differentiation are the two first priority drivers that we use to determine what to deploy. If we can achieve scale through standardization across operators, we will do that, but it's really a second order concern.
So what is it about de facto standards versus standards that are produced in something like OMA, which lead to perhaps de facto standards becoming adopted more quickly than others? So what is it about the standard that makes it, if somebody comes out quickly with a standard that becomes de facto or people start using it, is that a risk to a standardized API or standard in that way? Do you see the point I'm making?
Well, and that's what, for me, what is a good API? Well, it's an API used by a lot of people. So, and a lot of standard API are not used by anybody, so at that point, why the point? And that's, for me, why de facto is important. Twilio is a good API because it's used by 250,000 developers. Are they perfect? Not necessarily, but that's good because 250,000 users use them. We have, sometimes operators have a tendency to say, well, but Twilio missed that, which means I create a better API, but it's not used by anybody, and therefore it's useless.
So what can OMA do? Sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, I think Bryan makes a good point, other Bryan, that time to market is a big deal too. So, one of the challenges with any kind of standard, not just in the telecom space, anywhere, I imagine it's even much bigger when you're dealing with hardware, is the time that it takes to get everyone to agree. And so if in a sense, you're kind of then in a position where you're appealing to not quite the lowest common denominator, but the kind of lowest viable common denominator. And it's less about getting 100% of people to agree, but getting something that is like on a fundamental level, accomplishing what people need, and then getting it out there in a timely fashion. So, like Michel says, I mean, Twilio is an example. We very narrowly focus on one thing, do it pretty well, but certainly not the answer for everything. So what we focused on was what we could control and get out in a timely fashion.
So, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to echo, it all comes down to usage. A good API or an API that should be adopted is one that has a lot of users, and the users are giving feedback. And they know what worked, they know what's missing, and that helps the de facto standard to grow and evolve a little bit.
So in terms of the way that OMA creates standardized APIs, or specified APIs if you like, what can OMA do better in terms of its specification to try to help adoption?
Well, I'll start that one. I think it all comes down to providing examples. Actually, not only having the APIs implemented, but having places where they're in use and where they're showing the usage and showing some of the really cool or neat stuff that is brought out in an application by using them.
Yeah, I mean, and again, not trying to make this a sales pitch or anything, but one of the things that struck me when I first joined Twilio a couple years ago which was beginning in 2011, is we didn't have a sales force at that time. We do now, focus on business and enterprise. But at that time, we were a couple of years into an effort to basically evangelize the platform and really educate people, like you're saying, on how to use it. And that's on several levels. It's putting the documentation out there outside of the registration process to actually put it out there so people can understand it. Constantly iterate to try to put quick starts and how-tos and examples, and then having literally developers that go around and kind of represent the company and just kind of educate people and come up with demos and attend hackathons and meetups. And it was several years of effort doing that. And slowly iterating the product over time that really got people to understand. Because it's less about adoption, it's more, in the beginning, it's more about teaching people how to use it.
Another piece is the scope. See, one thing OMA and every standard organization should do is making sure that they have a proper scope of what they address. See, the tendency will be to be overarching. It's like you can do all M2M, or you can do all application development using IMS. Well, guess what? No. And that was the scope issue. Right? IMS cover is good for that. It should cover that, should expose this type of API, but doesn't try to solve all the development problem because over the top don't really care. So that's for me one of the pitfalls of a lot of standards, lack of scope.
And I'd say is don't try to solve problems that are already being solved elsewhere. Solve problems that no one else has any interest in solving, that you guys can add a lot more value to, like this idea of federation or single interfaces or someplace out in the future, because if there's already something out there right now, they don't probably need another solution.
And lastly, I think OMA needs to know where the users and the developers are. We shouldn't expect to build it and have them come to us. We have to go to them and understand what they need.
So in terms of that, getting developers involved, how do you do that? So Twilio, presumably when you were developing that platform, how did you work with developers to get that feedback? You were talking about iteration. What methodology did you use for that?
Well, I think Michel hit on it a little bit. One is in the very beginning, try not to be too, overarching in what you're what the scope is. It's good to have focus, but also, know what your actual capability is in the beginning. So, and one of the reasons for that is it allows you to iterate, but also you may end up in a different place and see people doing different things than you had originally thought. We always say that, we know that we don't have the best ideas, but we're going to put the tools in place so that the people with the best ideas, the developers, can start doing interesting things. And that's what leads you to, over several years, the development and really kind of iteration with the requirements of the developer community. So, we never thought we'd be in the business of doing a bunch of, having so many customers doing two-factor authentication. It didn't even cross our mind. But we saw so many people start doing it, we started building the tools to kind of address that. So it's that kind of constant feedback from your customers to then drive your agenda. It's, if we had gone out there and said we're going to do X, Y, Z in the very beginning, it might have maybe resulted in a different set of use cases. Go ahead.
Publish early, saying that don't try to keep a spec in a walled garden environment of OMA participants. Publish early, because you will get comment early, and maybe that will be a way to steer some of the standardization to the right place.
Did you want to comment at all? Okay, sorry.
One additional thing that we've been trying to do in OMA that we should do more, I think, is and this is the ability to get feedback is that we have to, as Michel I think put it last night, develop rough consensus and then actually implement and get feedback through the process of experience.
That was a lot of what I was going to say. You need to be able to, it's not just getting the information out there, just posting it or publishing, but you've got to have a way for there to become a conversation. You need to get the feedback, you need to get the experience, you need to have somebody say, well, that really didn't work the way you said it was going to, or I was able to do this as well with that, and create that dynamic.
Good. Thank you. Sorry. Okay.
I want to add, on the publish early, it's also, yes, having a good reference implementation. See why Amazon is a good de facto standard, because Amazon is a very good reference implementation for Amazon specification. Twilio is a good thing, because Twilio is the reference implementation for Twilio API, and that's one piece which is important. And generally, when you have a standard thing, you have not as complete or things which doesn't scale reference implementation, and that's what creates friction, because then it's not easy to actually make comments as way to say I'm developing something and I want to use a reference implementation to see it works.
Yeah. You were talking about the One API Exchange earlier, Michel. Do you want to talk a little bit about that ecosystem and how maybe that helps both developers and creators of APIs to bridge the two?
Well, the exchange is really about, it's kind of like a DNS equivalent, but for API. So instead of calling an API from AT&T or from Vodafone, you basically create a context first where you call a discovery service which return to you, call AT&T, and then your application works. The advantage of that is the fact that you don't have an aggregator in the middle. So AT&T is the developer owner, Vodafone is the developer owner if they want to own a developer ecosystem. And at that point, you don't create an extra layer which generally will at some point compete against the people who actually implement the APIs themselves. And that's why we moved away from WAC to actually this type of environment, because it created a much more simple, in a way, environment. Now, you can still have an aggregator, but then the aggregator will be a business decision by somebody to say, okay, fine on this, but I want to be on top. The same way in web, you have aggregator, but the aggregator is really a business decision instead of being just an artifact of creating an aggregator because we want to have a federation of people.
Yeah.
From our perspective, that's very exciting to have one interface be able to query and communicate with customers on many different carriers. I will say the Mobile Marketing Association rules with MMS and SMS, and then the rules for location consent are different depending on where you go, and those have to be rolled into this because it's just it's kind of the gum in the works. It's hard to make it uniform.
So I have a question for Michel related to that. Okay, so the role of aggregators versus a federated environment. One of the key questions is, does a federated environment mandate the need for standards-based solutions, or is it possible to federate in an environment of disparate solutions?
Well, the fact that you have a standard helps, because in a sense, you don't want to, as an application developer, developing adapters all the time, because adapters are complex to maintain anyway. So standard help. Now there are ways to have custom API in a federated environment, because it's not a federated environment is not the lowest common denominator. It's just the fact that if somebody is ready to deploy from somebody else, well, the scope of the API becomes less, but then it's explicit, and then the developer knows about that. And that's what you want when you describe a federation, is to be over-descriptive on what these APIs are for. So you don't surprise a developer with the fact that there is a limitation, just express that there is a limitation. Then if the API becomes popular, other people will then adopt it, and that's where the de facto standard is coming, and that's where it becomes a standard, and at that point it becomes widely spread.
So just to follow up, then you would say that if you have transparency about the differences in differentiated solutions in a federated environment, at least the developer is aware.
Exactly. Documentation is key. Where you have to really describe what your API is about, the scope of it, the limitation, and so forth. And see, the fact that an API has a latency is not necessarily a problem if it's described. Okay, you may want to be better, have less latency, but if you describe your latency, or if you describe the level of detail of what the API is about, guess what? The developer will cope with that. The problem is we have a tendency to hide too much.
Which is why we have this whole topic today, because it's so much easier to develop an over-the-top application and not deal with any of these things. And I think that's why we're here.
So you were talking about, as well earlier, about differentiation of customers. So how, and maybe this is a sort of point between the two, how does Twilio differentiate between different types of customers in terms of the way in which problems are handled, or severity, or prioritization, which was sort of the point I think you were making, Frank?
Well, I think what we try to think about the platform as not being specific to a type of customer. However, we do have certain types of use cases that gravitate toward messaging versus gravitate toward voice, and the underlying services for those from a kind of carrier perspective are different and handled differently. So we tend to think about things in buckets of like that fundamental service. So the way our product and engineering teams are really focused, and they're focused in teams, is in all the services from the kind of the primitives to the actual underlying core service related to voice. And then we have a bunch of teams kind of focused on all the things from top level to bottom level, focused on messaging. And so from in terms of the products we lay out there, we try to make it deliver it in a very uniform way. But in terms of solving the problems on the actual product on our side, we do think about it a little bit differently based on the medium.
So I have a question for you then. It's if there's a user, so someone who's doing 5 transactions a day, and there's someone else doing 1 million transactions a day, and they both send an escalation in for an outage, how are they handled differently?
Well, let's see. They're probably handled equally, to be honest with you. We do have some customers, like enterprise customers, that pay for premium support, which is its own product. But our customers basically are prioritizing based on urgency. It's not necessarily a dollar amount. I mean, our support team actually thinks that somebody that's spending $100 a month versus $100,000 a month is same level of urgency. So we focus on them all the same way. I think if that's what your question was. Yeah.
And if you have a SLA difference, then you need to describe it again. Like AT&T, I think, does a good job to say, I have a product API exposure and I have an alpha product API exposure. And you know that when you use an alpha API, guess what? You take more risk because it's alpha. But that's, I think, why OTT were pretty good at, in a sense. Like when you go to Google, they have an alpha version and they have a product version and they have then, and they don't, once it's a product version, everybody is treated the same way.
I think Google in general is like in beta still, isn't it, technically?
They're always in beta.
Yeah.
So there's another point there, which is the way in which APIs change and the support as APIs change. So in other words, if you write something as a developer, if it's going to be changing every 3 months and you've got to be keeping on top of that, then it's a lot harder than if you have a standardized API that isn't changing so quickly.
I also still agree with, and I think the TMF is working on that, which is about API, like almost like an FCAPS equivalent, but for API. FCAPS is a system view where fault configuration, accounting, performance, and security. Why not applying it to API, like understanding the latency at any moment could be or the variability. So when you look at what Amazon does, they have this RSS feed which gives you the variability of the service. So why not having a standard around that to say to people, hey, when you have an API, post the availability at any moment in form of an RSS feed. So things like this are, in a sense, still missing to make a mission-critical API business. But again, people are working on that.
You do have to make people aware and communicate when there's an update and when there's something to change or maybe an enhancement to an API. But fundamentally, when you publish an API, you're signing up to support that API as it's written for some amount of time, because the minute somebody grabs it and implements it, you have to be there you have to cover it. You have to support them. You have to make sure that that's going to work for them for a very reasonable long life cycle.
Okay, so just as a last point for everyone before we go to lunch, so I'm sure everyone wants you to all be quick. Where do you see yourselves fitting into the ecosystem in 2 years' time? What do you see the ecosystem being in respect to your position?
Well, I think I agree with some of the speakers or the panelists earlier this morning who said 2 years, things are not going to move very quickly in the next 2 years. I'm not sure we're going to be having conversations that are all that much different 2 years from now than we are today. I hope that awareness and the desire for the carriers, that aren't playing here and who are not exposing their networks yet, become interested. I do think that would be an interesting place for folks to go to, and I, believe that we can be there to support them through that. But I think we're going to have similar conversations still.
Okay, Bryan.
Yeah, for us, I mean, we're in a couple of years we're hoping to take the next step with communication, but we're still very focused on communication, meaning that we don't project ourselves to be in the business of doing presence or location or anything beyond that. Very specifically focused on the communication itself, voice, messaging, IP communication. That's what's most interesting. And the other thing is, sometimes we get obviously because of the telecom piece, we get we're in a lot of the same events and panels and conferences as operators, but we're not in the business of building networks. We rely very closely, or very importantly on carriers around the world. And so what we really want to do, in the next couple of years is make piece together a better global footprint and we need our global operator partners to do that. And so I think in the next 2 years, we would hopefully be exposing more things from those carrier networks that are particularly interesting, basically bringing together this critical mass of developers that we have and making more interesting use of the networks to which we connect.
Okay, thanks. Michel.
So IPG is in the API exposure business. So an API exposure is not just management for people. It's much more than that. And in 2 years, well, we'll see a great explosion of API exposure at all levels, not just the telco, but the retail industry, the finance industry, and whatsoever. So I guess it's a great place to be. And what we start to see is also more segmentation, in the sense that the monolithic system of the past are being more fragmented to be more like a set of tools which expose scoped API to do something pretty well, but again, much more scoped. And this trend has started a few years ago and will keep going. And 2 years, by the way, is you're right, it's short from a telco perspective. It's short, but it's a huge amount of time for over the top. When you think that SDN and NFV in Google has been implemented in 18 months in production, 2 years will mean that maybe all Android phones will become a remote blades of the data center. So we have to be careful of that, because these guys are moving fast, and especially in the domain of virtualized network or software-defined network. And that could be, if operators don't react well, another level of commoditization.
Frank.
I don't think we're going to see too much difference from our perspective. We're going to continue to use over-the-top applications. We're going to continue to use carrier APIs, and they both have their strengths, and we'll take advantage of both of them. I think they augment our services very well. We would love to see a single interface with single set of standard protocols and business rules, but I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Bryan.
Yeah, I think the point about things move very fastly on the internet is definitely something to consider. Telcos don't move quite as fast. We're in a real fundamental transition from time division networks to all IP. The rolling out of LTE, the shift from hardware to virtualization, a lot of very complex things in transformation. So we got our heads down probably over the next couple of years. But I do think you will see in the next couple of years a very big expansion in the APIs that enable social networking using carrier enablers like RCS in the U.S. In that time frame, I believe you'll definitely see RCS roll out, and you'll see APIs that enable the use of RCS in ways that we haven't seen before.
Thank you, Bryan. Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Shannon, Bryan, Michel, Frank, and Bryan. Thank you for spending all your time this morning listening.